welcome back to another episode of 5 Minutes with Jesus and Jesse. A lot of times when I am getting ready to record a video, I'm spending a lot of time in quiet time with God and doing Bible studies, devotionals, watching other people who have YouTube channels, etc., podcasts, whatever. And, sometimes I get messages from him saying, focus on this. But there's other times that stuff just keeps coming up and I'm like, okay, I get a hint. So what has been coming up recently is hating your brothers or sisters or hating other people. And it's just something that is always going to be a topic. It's always going to be a topic. There's always going to be somebody who is challenging, somebody who you don't get along with, maybe don't see eye to eye with. But as a Christian, we are called to love our brothers and sisters. So I want to dive into this. We're going to be in 1 John today, chapter 2 and chapter 3. Chapter 2 and chapter 3. So this has happened to me before. A previous colleague that I had, you could quote me, my friend Joni could quote me on this, saying, I care about him, but I don't like him. And she's like, yeah, we still can't say stuff like that. So this is just, if you have those people in your life that you're like, they grind your gears and you're like, I want to like them, I just can't, then we need to view them as Christ views them. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to start reading and then I'll get into discussion on that. So 1 John chapter 2, we're going to start on verse 3. We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says I know him but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know that we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus lived. And as I started studying this, I already had notes. I have notes all over my Bible always, like you can see post-it notes and all sorts of stuff in here. But I had two things written in here, which I love this for this topic. I have test of obedience and test of active love. So God calls us to do two things. He has two commands that are greater than everything else, and that is to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Love God, love people is essentially what that is. So as I'm reading this and I see this test of obedience, he says, you have come to know him if we keep his commands. That's the test of obedience. We're doing what God has called us to do. We're following his commands. The second part is the test of active love. Whoever claims to live in him must also live as Jesus lived. So we can't go around spreading hate, condoning, judging, all of these things to fellow people, not loving our neighbors as we would want to be loved, and be a follower of Jesus. Those two things do not go hand in hand. That's not how that works. So I'm going to keep reading on here. This is verse 9. Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in darkness. They do not know where they are going because the darkness has blinded them. If you are saying that you are living for Jesus and you are a believer of Christ and you are walking around in the darkness with hatred in your heart, those two things cannot exist. If God's love is being made complete in us, we can't have darkness living in here also because God is light. Those two things cannot coexist. It also goes on to say in chapter 3, do not be surprised, my brother and sister, if the world hates you. We'll know that we've passed from death to life because we love one another. Anyone who does not love remains in death. It's literally that drastic. If you do not love your neighbor as yourself, if you do not love God's people, then you are living in death. You're not living in life. So you can't have these two things coexist. And John brings this up a lot in his text as he's writing. You'll see contrast between darkness and light, death and life, truth and lies. John is basically saying throughout 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, you can't have these two things that coexist. Either you live for God, you're following his commands, and you're living in the way that Jesus would, or you're not. And he even goes on to say, anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer, and no murderer has eternal life living in them. That's how serious this is to God. He gives us two very important commands: love God and love people. We can't go around spreading hate and being hateful towards people and live for God. You can't do those two things at once. We can't go around with hate in our hearts and say that we live for Christ. Because if we're truly living this out, if we're truly living as Jesus did, what would Jesus do? Jesus ate with the sinners. Jesus healed people who had horrible backgrounds. Jesus restored the prostitute. He empowered the murderer Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. He hung on the cross next to criminals. So don't think that because you have a tiff with someone or you have unforgiveness in your heart that Jesus would condone that or do the same thing, because he wouldn't. So this is really just a message for me, myself included. You need to check yourself and check your feelings, because if we're truly following his commands and living as he did, we're not hating other people. So it's just a great reminder to just, as you're going to be in all of these situations with people you may or may not get along with, just remember that if we need to truly live as Jesus lived, and that's without hate.